December 19, 1944. The frozen countryside of Belgium trembled under the roar of engines and the grinding thunder of steel tracks. German tanks were advancing again, smashing through American defenses with terrifying speed. The ground shook as armored columns rolled westward through the snow-covered roads of the Ardennes. This was the height of the Battle of the Bulge, the last great offensive launched by Adolf Hitler in a desperate attempt to change the outcome of World War II. For the German army, the plan was bold and dangerous. More than 200,000 soldiers and hundreds of tanks had surged forward under the code name Operation Watch on the Rhine. Their goal was simple, but incredibly ambitious: smash through the thin American lines in the Ardennes forest, seize vital fuel depots, and race toward the port city of Antwerp. If the Germans succeeded, they could split the Allied armies in half and force a negotiated peace before the Soviet forces reached Berlin. For the first few days, the plan seemed to work. American units were caught completely by surprise. Many had been resting after months of combat and believed the Ardennes sector was quiet and unlikely to see major fighting. Instead, they suddenly found themselves facing one of the largest armored offensives of the war. German Panzer divisions burst through the lines. Entire American battalions vanished and its command posts were captured. Supply depots were overrun. Refugees flooded the icy roads while soldiers scrambled to establish defensive positions. The weather made things worse. Heavy snow and thick cloud cover grounded Allied aircraft, removing one of the greatest advantages the Americans usually possessed: air superiority. Without planes in the sky, the German armor could move almost freely. Columns of tanks pushed forward rapidly, sometimes advancing so quickly that American supply units didn't realize enemy forces were approaching until they could actually hear German voices echoing down the road. Leading one of these spearheads was a veteran armored formation, the 2nd Panzer Division. This division had fought across Europe for years. They had rolled through France in 1940. They had battled across the Eastern Front. They had fought Allied forces in North Africa. Now they were once again at the tip of Germany's armored spear. Their objective was critical. They were ordered to reach the bridges over the Meuse River before American reinforcements could arrive. If they captured the bridges, German armor could surge deep into Allied territory. The road to Dinant would open, and the entire Allied front might collapse. By December 19th, the division was still on schedule. Behind the lead tank stretched a massive convoy, nearly 10 miles long, Panzer IVs, powerful Panther tanks, armored half-tracks filled with infantry, trucks loaded with ammunition, and fuel vehicles struggling along the icy roads. The German advance seemed unstoppable, but ahead of them lay a small crossroad near the quiet Belgian village of Foy-Notre-Dame. It looked insignificant, just 2 narrow roads crossing through open farmland. Yet those roads led directly toward American supply routes and the bridges the Germans desperately needed. And at that lonely crossroads waited a single American tank, an M4 Sherman. Its crew belonged to Company A of the 9th Armored Division. Painted on the side of the tank was its nickname, Colorado Kid. Inside were 4 young men who had already survived brutal combat. Their commander was Staff Sergeant William May Carter, a 24-year-old tank commander from Denver, Colorado. With him were the rest of his crew: Corporal James Rothwell, the gunner, a 22-year-old from Ohio who had developed a reputation for deadly accuracy with the Sherman's main gun; Private First Class Tony Caserta, the loader, just 19 years old and originally from Brooklyn. His job was to keep the gun fed with shells as fast as the gunner could fire them. And finally, Eugene DeLeo, the driver, only 20 years old, from Pennsylvania. He controlled the heavy machine from the cramped driver's seat at the front of the tank. Like most American tank crews in late 1944, they were experienced and exhausted. They had been fighting continuously since September. They had crossed Luxembourg. They had supported infantry attacks through forests and villages. They had seen friends killed by German anti-tank guns and artillery. Yet nothing they had experienced before to what was about to happen at that crossroads. Earlier that morning, their battalion had received urgent orders. German armor was advancing rapidly toward their sector. No one knew exactly how many tanks were approaching. The orders were simple: establish blocking positions along the main roads, hold them as long as possible, then withdraw before being overrun. Company A spread its Shermans across multiple potential German routes, placing tanks at key intersections where they might delay the enemy advance. McCarter's tank drew one of the most important positions, a crossroads about 3 miles southeast of Dinant. When the crew arrived, they quickly studied the terrain. The crossroads itself was small and exposed. Open farmland stretched in every direction. Snow covered the frozen ground. A few bare trees stood along the roadside. The only real cover available was a low stone wall running alongside one of the roads. Still, McCarter immediately recognized the tactical importance of the position. If German tanks reached this crossroads, they would have a clear path toward American supply lines and the bridges beyond. Stopping them here, even for a short time, could be crucial. So McCarter carefully positioned Colorado Kid behind the stone wall. The tank's hull was angled slightly to present its thickest armor toward the expected direction of the German advance. Branches were cut from nearby trees and placed across the hull to help break up the tank's silhouette. Inside the Sherman, the crew prepared for battle. Caserta stacked spare shells within easy reach of the loader's position. Armor-piercing rounds for enemy tanks, high-explosive shells for infantry. Rothwell checked the main 75mm gun again and again, making sure the sights were perfectly aligned. Kept the engine idling softly, ready to move if necessary. McCarter scanned the surrounding countryside through the tank's periscope. Then they waited. The hours passed slowly. The tank dropped below freezing. Snowflakes drifted down through the gray afternoon sky. Far away, faint artillery thunder echoed across the countryside. The German offensive was moving closer. Finally, at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, the first sign of the enemy appeared. German reconnaissance troops. 2 motorcycles with sidecars approached cautiously along the eastern road. Through his periscope, McCarter watched them carefully. The motorcycles slowed to a stop roughly 400 yards from the crossroads. The German scouts dismounted. One of them lifted a pair of binoculars and began scanning the intersection.
Inside the Sherman, the crew remained completely still. No one spoke.
McCarter considered opening fire, but the distance was long, and revealing their position too early could give away their only advantage. After a few tense moments, the scouts climbed back onto their motorcycles. The engines roared to life. They turned around and disappeared. McCarter knew exactly what that meant. The scouts had seen nothing suspicious. They would report the road clear, and soon the main German column would arrive. 15 minutes later, the distant rumble of heavy engines rolled across the frozen countryside. Sound grew louder, and the first German tanks appeared on road, Panzer IVs. Behind them came the far more powerful Panther tanks. Armored half-tracks followed close behind, carrying squads of Panzer Grenadier infantry. McCarter watched silently as the column approached. He counted tanks as they rolled closer, 10, 12, 15, 16. Finally, he stopped counting. The line of vehicles stretched far beyond the horizon. This was not a patrol. This was the main advance of an entire Panzer division, and it was heading directly toward his position. Inside the Sherman, the crew understood the situation immediately. One tank was not supposed to fight a column like this. According to every rule of armored warfare, they should withdraw immediately, but retreating would leave the crossroads open, and the German advance would continue unopposed. McCarter said nothing for a long moment. He simply watched through the periscope as the lead Panzer IV rolled closer and closer to the intersection. 800 yards, 700, 600. Suddenly the German tank stopped. Its turret began turning slowly toward the stone wall. The enemy crew had spotted the American Sherman. A second later, the Panzer IV. The shell screamed past Colorado Kid, missing by less than 20 feet. Inside the Sherman, Rothwell already had the German tank centered in his sights. McCarter didn't hesitate. He gave a single command fire. The Sherman's 75mm cannon exploded with a thunderous blast. The armor-piercing shells streaked across the frozen field and slammed into the front of the Panzer IV. The impact was devastating. The German tank shuddered violently as the shell penetrated its armor. Smoke burst from the engine deck. Moments later, the hatches flew open and the German crew scrambled out, running for cover. The first enemy tank was destroyed, but that single shot had just announced their presence to an entire Panzer division, and the real battle for the crossroads had only just begun. The moment the first Panzer IV burst into flames, the entire German column ground to a halt. For several seconds, the road was silent except for the crackling fire of the destroyed tank and the distant rumble of engines stretching far back along the frozen road. Inside Colorado Kid, the crew of the M4 Sherman understood something important had just happened. They had not simply destroyed a tank. They had stopped the entire advance of the 2nd Panzer Division. German doctrine was cautious when dealing with ambushes. Whenever a lead tank was destroyed, commanders assumed the road might be mined or defended by multiple hidden anti-tank guns. And that's exactly what the German officers suspected now. From their perspective, it was impossible that a single American tank could have caused such destruction. They assumed something larger was waiting, maybe a full American tank company, maybe concealed anti-tank guns hidden in the tree line, maybe artillery observers preparing to call on fire, so the German column stopped. That pause, only a few minutes long, was the first delay McCarter and his crew had created. But the Germans quickly began to react. A 2nd Panzer IV attempted to maneuver off road to flank the Sherman's position. The tank commander ordered his driver to push across the snow-covered field, but the frozen ground concealed a drainage ditch hidden beneath the snow. The heavy tank lurched suddenly. Its right track slipped down into the ditch. The driver tried to reverse. The track spun wildly, throwing snow and frozen mud into the air. But the tank was stuck. Inside Colorado Kid, gunner James Rothwell saw the opportunity instantly. Target stuck tank, McCarter nodded. Fire. The Sherman's cannon thundered again. The armor-piercing shell struck the trapped Panzer directly at the turret ring, the narrow gap between the turret and hull. It was one of the most vulnerable points on any tank. The shell penetrated cleanly. An instant later, smoke poured from the turret. The 2nd German tank was disabled. 2 burning vehicles now blocked the narrow road. Behind them, the rest of the German column began backing up, trying to create space to maneuver. German officers shouted orders. Infantry began dismounting from half-tracks. The situation was becoming complicated, but then something even more dangerous appeared. A Panther tank rolled slowly forward. Compared to the Panzer IV, the Panther was a deadly opponent. Its armor was thicker, its gun was more powerful. At almost any distance, a Panther's cannon could penetrate the Sherman's armor. But the opposite was not always true. McCarter knew the danger immediately. If that Panther fired and hit them squarely, the fight would be over. Inside the Sherman, the atmosphere grew tense. Rothwell adjusted the sight carefully. The Panther continued advancing down the road, its long barrel pointing directly toward the crossroads. The distance closed, 500 yards, 400, 350. Then suddenly the Panther fired. The shell slammed into the front of Colorado Kid with an ear-splitting metallic crash. Inside the tank, the crew felt the entire vehicle ring like a giant bell. For a moment, everyone thought they were dead, but the round had struck at an angle. Instead of penetrating, it ricocheted upward and deflected over the turret. McCarter blinked in disbelief. They were still alive. Driver Eugene DeLeo shouted something from the front of the tank, but the ringing in everyone's ears made it impossible to hear clearly. Rothwell was already adjusting the gun. He knew the Sherman's cannon could not penetrate the Panther's thick frontal armor. But if the Panther exposed its side, there might be a chance. For several seconds, the two tanks faced each other across the snow-covered road. Then the German commander made a small but fatal mistake. Trying to reduce his target profile, he angled his tank slightly. For a brief moment, the Panther's thinner side armor became visible. That was all Rothwell needed. Got him, he whispered. McCarter didn't hesitate. Fire. The Sherman's gun roared once more. The armor-piercing shell slammed into the side. For a split second, nothing happened. Then the tank erupted in a massive explosion. The shell had penetrated directly into the Panther's ammunition storage. The resulting detonation was catastrophic. Flames burst from every hatch. The turret was blown partially off the hull by the internal blast. The third German tank was destroyed. Now the entire road was blocked by burning wrecks. Panzer commanders farther back in the column stared in disbelief. 3 tanks destroyed, and the position still firing. From their perspective, it made no sense. There had to be more than one tank. No single Sherman could possibly be causing this much damage. So the German battalion commanders halted the advance again. Officers gathered several hundred yards back along the road, studying the battlefield through binoculars. Radio operators tried contacting higher headquarters. Reports were confused. Some observers claimed there were multiple American tanks hidden behind the wall. Others insisted they could only see one. Meanwhile, inside Colorado Kid, McCarter was starting to realize something was wrong. The near miss from the Panther had caused more damage than they first thought. Rothwell tried to rotate the turret again. The hydraulic system responded sluggishly. Traverses slow, he reported. That meant the turret could no longer turn quickly. Instead of powered movement, they would have to crank the turret manually. That was much slower and much more dangerous in a duel. Then another problem appeared. McCarter tried using the radio to report the German column. There was no response. The radio was dead. The Panther's shell had probably destroyed the antenna. They were now completely cut off from the rest of the 9th Armored Division. No one knew they were here. No one knew they were facing an entire Panzer division. And then loader Tony Kessert had discovered something even worse. While checking the tank systems, he noticed the right track controls were not responding properly. The Panther's near miss had damaged part of the drive mechanism. The tank could still fire, but it could no longer move. Colorado Kid was now completely immobilized. McCarter understood the situation instantly. They had become a stationary target. According to standard U.S. armored doctrine, this situation had only one correct response: abandon the tank. If a tank became immobilized while facing superior enemy forces, the crew was supposed to destroy the vehicle and return on foot. The lives of trained crewmen were considered far more valuable than the tank itself. Every manual said the same thing: save them and lose the machine. McCarter sat silently for a moment. Through the periscope, he could see German infantry beginning to spread across the snowy fields. More tanks were maneuvering farther back along the road. The Germans were preparing another attack. If they stayed, the odds of survival were extremely low, but if they left, the crossroads would be undefended. The 2nd Panzer Division would push through without delay, and the German advance toward the Meuse River might continue unchecked. McCarter turned to his crew. His voice was calm. He explained the situation clearly. The tank couldn't move. The radio was destroyed. The Germans were preparing another assault. Then he told them what the manual said they should do: abandon the tank, withdraw while they still could. But after a short pause, he added something else. What I think we should do, he said quietly, is stay here and hold this road as long as possible. He looked at each of them in turn. This crossroads matters, he continued. If we leave, those tanks roll straight through. He didn't order them to stay. Instead, he gave them a choice. Anyone who wanted to leave could go. No arguments, no punishment, no judgment. Just get out and head back toward American lines. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The sound of German engines echoed faintly in this. Gunner James Rothwell broke the silence. "We stay," he said simply. The others nodded. The decision was made. 4 men in a broken tank would try to stop an entire Panzer division, and the next German attack was already beginning. The next German assault began shortly after 4 o'clock in the afternoon. This time, the commanders of the 2nd Panzer Division were determined to eliminate the American position once and for all. The earlier advance had been cautious. They believed they might be multiple hidden tanks or anti-tank guns, but now German reconnaissance reported something surprising. Only one tank had been seen firing from behind the stone wall, just one M4 Sherman. The German officers didn't quite believe the report, but they were unwilling to delay their entire offensive any longer, so they prepared a more organized attack. Infantry units of Panzer Grenadiers dismounted from their half-tracks and spread out across the snow-covered field, suppressed the American tank while the German armor maneuvered into position for a killing shot. It was standard combined arms tactics. Infantry would flush the enemy out, tanks would finish the fight. Across the frozen farmland, dozens of German soldiers began advancing cautiously toward the crossroads. Inside Colorado Kid, Staff Sergeant William McCarter watched them through his periscope. "Infantry moving," he said. Immediately, the Sherman's machine guns opened fire. Driver Eugene DeLeo controlled the bow-mounted machine gun at the front of the tank, sending bursts of bullets across the open field. Loader Tony Cassiter grabbed the turret machine gun and began firing through the hatch. Streams of tracer rounds cut through the falling snow. The open terrain that had seemed like a disadvantage earlier suddenly became an advantage for the defenders. The German soldiers had almost no cover. Bullets kicked up snow and dirt around them as they tried to advance. Several Panzer Grenadiers dropped to the ground. Others dove behind small ridges or shallow ditches in the frozen earth. The infantry attack stalled almost immediately, but the German tanks were still advancing. Another Panzer IV rolled forward cautiously, its turret turning toward the stone wall. Instead of firing armor-piercing rounds, the German tank began launching high-explosive shells. The explosions slammed into the ground around the Sherman. Chunks of frozen earth blasted into the air. Shrapnel rattled again. The tank's armor like a hailstorm. One shell struck the stone wall itself, blowing apart a large section of the cover that had been protecting Colorado Kid. Inside the Sherman, the noise was deafening. Each explosion shook the tank violently, but the armor held. McCarter waited patiently. He knew the German tank had to expose itself for a clear shot. Finally, the Panzer IV rolled forward just a little too far. Gunner James Rothwell already had the target lined up. "On target," he said calmly. "Fire," McCarter ordered. The Sherman's gun thundered again. The armor-piercing shell struck the Panzer IV directly on its turret. The impact punched through the armor and detonated inside the fighting compartment. Flames erupted from the hatches. The 4th German tank was destroyed. Smoke from the burning vehicles now drifted across the crossroads. The road itself was completely blocked by wreckage. For the German commanders, the situation was becoming a nightmare. Their entire advance was stalled by what still appeared to be a small American defensive position. Behind the front line, miles of vehicles were now backed up along the narrow road. Fuel trucks,
Ammunition carriers, half-tracks filled with infantry.
Every minute of delay threatened the success of the entire offensive. They were supposed to reach the bridges over the Meuse River within a matter of days. Instead, they had spent hours trying to destroy a single American tank. The German battalion commander decided to escalate. He ordered forward one of the most feared weapons of the war, the 88mm flak gun. Originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, the German 88 had become legendary as an anti-tank gun. Its powerful shells could destroy almost any Allied tank at long range. 2 of these massive guns were quickly brought into position about 2 kilometers away from the crossroads. From that distance, they could fire directly at the American tank while remaining completely out of range of the Sherman gun. Inside Colorado Kid, McCarter spotted the new threat through his periscope. 88s, he said quietly. Everyone inside the tank understood what that meant. Against those guns, they had almost no chance. The first shell came screaming toward them seconds later. It slammed into the ground just beside the tank, blasting snow and debris across the hull. The second round struck what remained of the stone wall, obliterating it completely. Chunks of stone crashed down around the Sherman. Then the third shell hit the turret directly. Inside the tank, there was a tremendous metallic crash. For a moment, the crew expected the vehicle to explode, but nothing happened. The shell had penetrated the turret roof, yet it had failed to detonate. It was a dud. For a moment, no one moved. The crew stared at the metal shell lodged inside the turret near the gun breech. Any functioning explosive round would have instantly killed everyone inside the tank, but this one simply sat there silently. It was an unbelievable stroke of luck. Later, historians would note something interesting about German ammunition during the later years of the war. Many shells were manufactured by forced laborers inside factories run by the Nazi regime. Some workers deliberately sabotaged the ammunition whenever possible. Small defects were introduced during production. Occasionally, those defects prevented shells from exploding. One of those defective shells had just saved the lives of the crew inside Colorado Kid, but the hit had still caused serious damage. Fragments from the impact had jammed parts of the gun mechanism. Rothwell examined the breach quickly. His face was grim. "The gun's damaged," he said. McCarter looked at him. "Can it fire?" Rothwell hesitated. "Maybe once. The breach might hold for a single shot, or it might shatter." If the mechanism failed, the explosion inside the turret could kill everyone instantly. That meant they now had only one shot left. After that, their only weapons would be machine guns. Outside, the German artillery prepared to fire again. Another direct hit from an 88 would almost certainly destroy the tank. But at that exact moment, something unexpected happened. The weather changed. The light snowfall that had been drifting down all afternoon suddenly intensified into a thick snowstorm. Within minutes, visibility dropped dramatically. German artillery observers lost sight of the American tank. Without visual contact, the 88 crews could no longer aim
accurately.
The shelling stopped. Across the battlefield, both sides paused. For the first time in hours, there was silence around the crossroads. Inside Colorado Kid, the crew used the brief break to prepare. They checked their remaining ammunition, they redistributed machine gun belts, they filled their canteens with freezing water and ate small portions of K-rations. No one said what they were all thinking. The next attack would likely be the last. And this time the Germans would come with overwhelming force. But none of them suggested abandoning the tank. They had already made their decision, they would say. Even if the odds of survival were almost zero, and somewhere beyond the snowstorm, the engines of German tanks were already starting again. The snowstorm lasted less than an hour. But during that short time, both sides prepared for what they knew would be the final confrontation at the crossroads near Foy Notre Dame. Inside the crippled M4 Sherman known as Colorado Kid, crew worked silently. Staff Sergeant William E. Carter studied the battlefield through the periscope again and again, trying to predict where the next attack would come from. The tank could no longer move. The radio was destroyed. The main gun might only fire once more before failing completely. And yet somehow, they had already destroyed 4 German tanks and delayed the advance of the powerful 2nd Panzer Division for hours. But the Germans were not finished. As the snow began to thin, shapes slowly emerged from the white haze. German armor. This time they were advancing differently. The previous attacks had been cautious, almost probing. Now the German commanders were done experimenting. 5 Panther tanks rolled forward in a wide line across the frozen farmland instead of staying on the road. Behind them came groups of Panzer Grenadier infantry spreading out carefully, using the tanks as moving shields. Half-tracks remained farther back, ready to deliver supporting fire. The Germans were going to overwhelm the American position through sheer numbers. Inside the Sherman, McCarter watched the formation approach. 5 Panthers, he said quietly. No one replied. They all knew the odds. Each of those tanks had thicker armor, a stronger gun, and better range than their Sherman. If even one of them got a clear shot, the fight would be over instantly. McCarter turned toward Rothwell. 1 round left, he reminded him. Rothwell nodded. They both understood what it meant. The single remaining shell had to count. Outside, the German tanks continued advancing slowly. 400 yards, 350. The massive machines moved carefully across the field, their long guns pointing toward the crossroad. Behind them, infantry crawled through the snow, ready to rush the position once the tanks suppressed the American defenders. Inside Colorado Kid, the crew prepared themselves. Machine guns were loaded. Extra ammunition belts were laid across the turret floor. Personal weapons, pistols, and rifles were checked in case the tank was overrun. For a moment, the interior of the Sherman was silent except for the faint hum of the engine and the distant rumble of approaching armor. McCarter rested his hand on the firing switch. 275 yards, 250. The Panthers were almost within perfect firing range. Then suddenly the battlefield exploded. Massive artillery shells crashed down across the advancing German formation. The ground erupted in violent bursts of fire and dirt. 1 Panther took a direct hit. The explosion tore the turret completely off the tank and hurled it several feet into the air. Another shell struck near a 2nd Panther, blasting apart its tracks and sending the heavy vehicle sliding sideways across the frozen ground. German infantry scattered in panic, diving for cover as more shells rained down. The sudden barrage was devastating. It was American artillery somewhere miles away. Forward observers had finally detected the massive German column, and they had responded immediately. Multiple batteries were now firing simultaneously. The shells marched across the battlefield like a hammer striking steel. Inside Colorado Kid, the crew stared in shock. For hours, they believed they were completely alone. Now suddenly, the sky itself seemed to be fighting on their side. McCarter didn't waste the opportunity. Now, he shouted. Rothwell already had the nearest Panther in his sights, firing. The Sherman's cannon roared for what might be the last time. The damaged breech held together just long enough. The armor-piercing round streaked across the snowy field and struck the Panther's lower hull. The shell penetrated the engine compartment. Flames burst from the rear of the tank as fuel ignited. The 5th German tank was destroyed. For a moment, the battlefield became chaos. German crews struggled to reposition their vehicles while artillery continued falling around them. Infantry attempted to regroup, but the barrage had shattered their formation. From the German perspective, the situation now looked even worse than before. Not only was the crossroads defended by a stubborn American tank, but now heavy artillery had joined the fight. They believed they had stumbled into a much larger defensive position. The German battalion commander made a difficult decision. He ordered his units to withdraw temporarily and reorganize. The risk of losing more was too high, and every minute they spent here delayed their march toward the Meuse River. Slowly, the remaining Panthers began pulling back. Infantry retreated across the snow-covered field. The artillery barrage continued for several minutes before finally fading into silence. At the crossroads, smoke drifted upward from the wrecks of destroyed German vehicles. Burning fuel crackled in the cold air. Inside Colorado Kid, the 4 crewmen sat in stunned exhaustion. They had been fighting for nearly 6 hours. Their ears rang from explosions, their throats were dry from smoke and dust. Still alive, and somehow they had stopped the advance for the moment. Then about 20 minutes later, new engines approached from the opposite direction.
American vehicles. A column of M10 tank destroyers rolled cautiously toward the crossroads. They belonged to the 75th Tank Destroyer Battalion. The American commanders had expected to find German tanks already pouring through the intersection. Instead, they discovered something astonishing, a battlefield filled with destroyed German armor. Shell craters scattered across the snow, and in the center of it all, one immobilized Sherman tank. The commander of the lead M10 climbed down from his vehicle and walked toward the battered Sherman. He looked at the destroyed German tanks scattered around the crossroads. Then he looked at the 4 exhausted men climbing slowly out of the turret hatch. Question: how long have you been holding this position?
McCarter checked his watch. His voice was hoarse. About 5.5 hours. The tank destroyer officer stared at him in disbelief. 5 hours, 1 immobilized tank, and an entire Panzer division delayed. Reinforcements quickly spread out around the crossroads, establishing proper defensive positions. American artillery observers continued tracking the German column as it pulled back. For the first time that day, the crossroad secure. The crew of Colorado Kid climbed down from their crippled tank. Their uniforms were blackened with smoke. Their hands trembled from exhaustion. One of them was wounded. Another could barely hear after hours inside the metal hull during constant explosions. But they had done something extraordinary. Against impossible odds, 4 men and a broken tank had stopped one of the most powerful armored divisions in the German army, and their actions had changed the course of the battle. The battlefield around the crossroads slowly grew quiet as evening settled over the frozen countryside. American soldiers from the 75th Tank Destroyer Battalion moved cautiously through the snow, checking the destroyed German vehicles and securing the area. Smoke drifted upward from burning wrecks scattered across the road and fields. In the center of it all stood the battered M4 Sherman known as Colorado Kid. Its right track was ruined. Its radio antenna had been shot away. The turret showed the scars of repeated impacts, including the hole where a German shell had penetrated but failed to explode. Yet despite the damage, the crew compartment remained intact. That fact alone had saved 4 lives. Staff Sergeant William McCarter and his crew were finally escorted away from the tank. For hours, they had been operating on adrenaline alone. Now that the fighting had stopped, the exhaustion hit them all at once. Private Tony Caserta had several small shrapnel wounds from fragments that had slipped inside the turret during earlier explosions. Driver Eugene DeLeo's hearing was badly damaged after hours inside the metal hull during artillery impacts. Gunner James Rothwell's hands were blistered and burned from handling hot shell casings during the intense firefight, and McCarter himself could barely stay on his feet. Still, they were alive, all 4 of them. American medics gave them water, bandaged wounds, and guided them toward a temporary field station behind the lines. Meanwhile, the newly arrived American forces strengthened the defensive positions around the crossroads near Foy-Notre-Dame. The delay created by the Sherman crew had already begun to change the situation. The powerful 2nd Panzer Division, which had been racing toward the bridges over the Meuse River, was now behind schedule. The hours lost at that small crossroads proved critical. American reinforcements began pouring into the region. Tank destroyer units, artillery batteries, infantry battalions. Within the room, there was a short time the entire sector was heavily defended. The German advance slowed dramatically, and the momentum of the offensive, once so terrifying, began to fade. The crossroads that had nearly fallen hours earlier was now firmly in American hands. For the German commanders, the delay required an explanation. Official reports from the division later described encountering strong American armored resistance, supported by multiple tanks and anti-tank positions, admitting that a single immobilized Sherman had halted the advance of an entire armored column was simply unacceptable, so the story was quietly altered in the records. But among the American soldiers who arrived at the crossroads, the truth quickly spread.
1 tank, 4 men, 5 destroyed German tanks,
More than 5 hours of resistance. The story sounded almost impossible, and yet the battlefield around them proved it had happened. 3 days later, recovery crews finally arrived to tow the damaged Sherman away. Soldiers had already begun visiting the site just to see the famous tank. Some posed for photographs beside the wreckage of German armor. Others examined the battlefield carefully, trying to understand how a single vehicle had controlled the entire intersection for so long. Eventually, Colorado Kid was hauled away to a repair depot, but the damage was too severe for the tank to return to combat. Instead, it was dismantled for parts. The engine was removed and installed into another Sherman. Transmission went to yet another vehicle. Even the repaired gun was eventually mounted on a replacement tank. The original hull of Colorado Kid was eventually scrapped, but its story lived on. Staff Sergeant McCarter and his crew spent several days recovering in a field hospital. During that time, intelligence officers interviewed them repeatedly. The officers struggled to believe the full story. 5 confirmed tank kills, a Panzer division delayed for nearly 6 hours, and all accomplished by single disabled Sherman crew. Each time they were asked how they had survived, McCarter always gave the same simple answer: luck, training, and a German shell that didn't explode. Their bravery did not go unnoticed. McCarter was recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross, one of the highest American military decorations for valor. Rothwell, Caserta, and DeLeo each received the Silver Star for their actions during the battle. The ceremony took place in January 1945, not long after the German offensive had been stopped. The medals were presented during a cold winter gathering outside the town of Bastogne, which had become one of the most famous battlefields of the Battle of the Bulge. The officer presenting the medals was none other than George S. Patton, one of the most famous American generals of the war. After pinning the Distinguished Service Cross onto McCarter's uniform, Patton asked him a simple question: "What made you decide to stay at that crossroads?" McCarter could have given a dramatic answer about courage or heroism. Instead, he simply said, "Someone had to hold that position. We were there, so we stayed." Patton studied him for a moment, then nodded. "That's the right answer, Sergeant," he said. "That's always the right answer." After recovering, the crew of Colorado Kid received a new tank. They named it Colorado Kid too. Together, they continued fighting through the rest of the winter campaign. They survived the final months of the war. They crossed the Rhine River during the Allied push into Germany. And when the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, all 4 men were still alive. After the war, they returned to civilian life. William McCarter went back to Denver, where he worked in construction and raised a family. He rarely talked about the war. When his children asked about his medals, he would simply say he had done his job like everyone else. James Rothwell settled in Ohio and became a school teacher. Every year on December 19th, he quietly remembered the day at the crossroads when 4 young soldiers had faced an entire armored column. Tony Caserta and Eugene DeLeo both lived in New York for many years. They remained friends and occasionally met to talk about their time in the Sherman. The memories of that day never completely faded, but neither did their pride in the decision they had made to stay to fight to hold the road. Decades later, in 1984, a military historian researching German records from the Battle of the Bulge discovered references to the mysterious delay near Foynaterdam. German reports described encountering strong American armor and extensive defenses. Curious about the details, the historian tracked down McCarter and interviewed him. By that time, McCarter was already in his 60s. He listened politely as the historian described the German documents. Then he calmly explained what had really happened: just 1 tank, just 4 men, and a crossroads that had to be defended. When asked why he hadn't retreated, McCarter gave a slightly different answer than he had given General Patton decades earlier. "If we left," he said, "the Germans would have gotten through and Americans further down the line would have died." He paused for a moment. "Someone had to pay the price to stop them. It might as well be us." William McCarter passed away in 1991. His crew followed in the years afterward, but their story remains one of the most remarkable small unit actions of World War II. It is not the story of a massive army or a famous general. It is the story of 4 ordinary soldiers who refused to abandon their position: 1 broken tank, 5 destroyed enemy vehicles, more than 5 hours against overwhelming odds, and a decision that helped slow one of the most dangerous offensives of the war. Today, the crossroads near Foynaterdam looks quiet and peaceful. Fields stretch across the Belgian countryside. The cars pass along the road without knowing what once happened there. Now marks the exact spot where Colorado Kid fought its last battle. But history remembers, because sometimes the outcome of great battles does not depend on thousands of soldiers. Sometimes it depends on a single crew in a single tank who decide they will not retreat. Voice chat.